Welcome to another wonderful Susannah Calloway audiobook. We are excited to have you with us. Before we begin the story, please like and subscribe to our channel and share it with friends. This allows us to continue adding free clean Western romance audiobooks for you to enjoy. The following title is copyrighted by Susannah Calloway, Western romance author. Now, find a comfortable spot, relax, and enjoy the story. Finding her father a bride. Chapter 1. Her father had become a shell of the man he'd used to be. 17-year-old Katie watched as he walked toward the house, his head hanging low as it always did since her mother passed a few years before. The twins were waiting on the porch for their father, wanting to get his attention, and Katie feared that once again, they'd be disappointed. She was right, he barely acknowledged them. She watched as his hand reached out and scuffed her brother's hair before opening the door to their house. She could remember days when her parents enjoyed their lives, smiling and laughing while doing the chores around the farm. Those were brighter days, filled with color and joy. But the world had turned gray ever since the Lakota natives raided their home and killed her mother. Since that tragedy, there was a sense of unease in the home, as though the ghost of her mother wandered the halls, wanting recompense. It didn't help that the twins bore a striking resemblance to their mother and were walking tributes to how beautiful she'd been, a constant and painful reminder. Katie sighed as she finished plucking the weeds from the garden her mother had started years before. Her hands were covered in dirt as she ripped weeds from the ground, taking her frustrations out on the plants. It was hard to see her father become more and more dejected as each day passed. His way of movement and the expression on his face were depressing, even to those who'd only just met him. Katie decided to make an amazing meal that evening, hoping her father would smile at the taste. It was a small act, but she hoped it would somehow make a difference, if only for that evening. Katie didn't make enough for everyone. Then again, she hadn't been expecting company. But of course, they had stopped by again. Howard and his daughter, Sarah, had been visiting more and more of late, ever since Sarah had come of age to marry. Katie groaned inwardly. Sarah was as dull as a stick of wood. Katie placed the last serving dish down, staring at the piddly amount she'd given herself compared to everyone else. It was to have been a hearty meal, but she'd barely doled herself out enough to be comfortable for the night. She took a seat at the end of the table, next to her father. Sarah was sitting directly across from her, admiring the meal Katie had put together. Little did Howard and his daughter know, she'd made it so that they could enjoy it as a family, alone and without company. She had been hoping to dine without interruption. "Now, this here looks nice, Katie. I can't believe you made this all on your own," Sarah said. "Thank you," Katie replied and poured herself some water. "The potatoes are my mom's recipe. That's why they're so good." She watched Sarah's expression shift as she lifted her fork. The words had just come out, but they had been tinged with pride and possessiveness. Katie couldn't help it. She didn't like the way Sarah kept looking at her father. Sarah was too inexperienced to understand the hard life he'd been through, and she was the last woman that Sarah could see him being happy with. And it was obvious to everyone but her father exactly what Howard had planned. Katie couldn't handle the thought of her father being with someone so young. Goodness, but Sarah wasn't that much older than she was. It was difficult enough to have to think of replacing her mother, but having to do so with someone like Sarah? It just wouldn't work. Katie took a bite of the small potatoes, which were lined up sparsely on her plate. She considered her options as Sarah laughed at something her father said. Was there a way out of this? What could she do to ensure that nothing ever came of Sarah's interest? Katie had heard of one option, and it seemed like the best one for the situation. But it would not please her father. Yet maybe, just maybe, it was the right route to go. If he had something like lightning appear in his life, it might just startle him back to the man he once was, to the man Katie missed sorely. She took another bite and chewed through the rosemary she'd placed on top as a garnish, just the way Mother always had. She chewed slowly, savoring the taste of the buttered potatoes, while she considered her next move. Katie knew that the time to act would have to be soon, as Howard and Sarah were trying harder every day. They'd been visiting more and more often as the days went by. There was an office in town that could help Katie with her plan. She suspected that it would disrupt their lives in ways she couldn't even fathom in that moment. But ordering a mail-order bride was possibly the quickest way to get this situation resolved. It would secure a woman closer to her father's age, and it would give the twins someone to look up to. Katie inhaled deeply as she swallowed. She'd get it done by morning. Chapter 2. It had only been one night since her mother had fallen, and her condition wasn't getting better. The fainting had only been the beginning. Since then, there had been a fever and a terrible cough. At one point, her mother's breathing had become so shallow that Adelia was sure she was dead. She held her hand tightly with both of hers. She could feel the habitual shivering that her mother's body suffered with throughout the day. Adelia watched as her chest lifted and lowered slowly, and her shallow, hollow breathing echoed throughout the bedroom. Adelia brought her wooden chair closer to the narrow bed and adjusted the cool cloth on her mother's forehead. She'd hoped that her mother would have a peaceful death, perhaps passing away in her sleep. To have to see her so weak and helpless, while also in such agony, was heart-wrenching. She felt her mother's hand grip hers a little stronger than she'd been able to do since the day she'd become bedridden. Adelia moved closer, and her mother's eyes fluttered open slowly. She turned her head to look at Katie, and Katie noted that her mother's eyes were bloodshot, perhaps from having coughed so much. Her hand felt clammy against her own, and she could see the thin film of sweat on her forehead. Adelia, I don't know how much longer I have," her mother said, her voice wavering and coarse. "I need you to promise me something." Adelia shook her head, feeling strands of her dark brown hair fall from the braid atop her head. "Don't say such things. You'll recover, I'm sure of it." Adelia knew it wasn't true, but she couldn't bear to have her mother give up hope. "I can feel it, Adelia. And my time is coming. It's a knowing that goes right down to my bones." Tears formed in Adelia's eyes, burning at her eyelids. Her mother was the only family she had left. Losing her would mean losing everything that was important to her. Together, they had built a life in New York without the help of anyone else. "I want you to move away from here." Adelia raised her eyebrows, unsure of what to make of such a comment. Leave New York? It was true that the stigma of Adelia being part native had stopped anyone from becoming interested in marrying her, but even without her mother, Adelia might be able to survive. Perhaps she could get work at a factory, or at a cafe. There were possibilities here in this big city, even for a single woman. "But Mama," Adelia said, "this is our home." Her mother shook her head, which caused a fit of coughing so hard her face reddened. Adelia wiped around her mother's mouth with the cool rag and placed it on the bedside table next to her. Adelia's heart squeezed in pain at the anguish in her mother's eyes. "When I'm gone, this will no longer be your home. You and I both know that. I want you to make a home of your own. New York is not the place for you." Adelia frowned. "I don't understand. I was raised here, Mama. How can it not be the place where you want me to live?" Her mother coughed again, and leaned back weakly against the pillow, exhaling thinly. "I want you to live a full life. I want you to get married, find someone who loves you, and have a family. New York is not the place for you to do that. God has other plans." If God had other plans, wouldn't he have made them obvious to her? But, yet, Adelia wondered if her mother was right. Without her around, it would be harder to stay in the apartment alone, and Adelia would be left with the responsibility of paying for everything herself. "Mama, everything is going to be fine. You'll see." Her mother rallied then, her eyes growing clearer. "I've lived in this city far longer than you, and I know this is not your place. Promise me that you'll leave and create a new life somewhere wonderful. Somewhere that you will find true happiness." Adelia inhaled and looked deeply into her mother's eyes. She had no choice but to agree, especially since it might be the last thing she would ever promise her. If her mother was right, her future might truly lie elsewhere. "I promise, Mama," she said finally, and cradled her mother's hand gently. "I promise I'll leave. I'll find a way and head out of the city, and maybe find a new life, if I can." "You will," her mother said, smiling shakily. I know it. Adelia was right, it was the last promise she ever made to her mother, for her dear mother slipped away during her sleep that night. And it was a peaceful death, for which Adelia was deeply grateful. The rent was due by the first day of the next month, and the funds that she and her mother had left weren't enough to cover expenses for very long. Adelia decided to find a place where she could create a fresh start for herself. She wasn't sure how she'd accomplish that just yet, but she decided to pick up a local paper and look at the adverts. If there was any way she could start a new life, she'd first have to get a job somewhere. She flipped through the paper, scanning everything. The classifieds were numerous and were filled with opportunities within the city. There were a few located just out of town. She held her breath and kept looking, but there didn't seem anything for which she was qualified. She sipped her tea and leaned back in the stuffed chair her mother had loved since they'd moved into the apartment. Every day, her mother would sit at the window come evening and listen to the sounds of New York while she enjoyed a good book. Adelia felt her lip quiver at the thought. It had been a week since she'd watched her mother's casket lowered into the ground, its wood creaking as they placed it into the yawning hole where her body would reside forever. An entire week. Adelia had tried to step into the housekeeping job her mother had left empty, but she was refused, likely due to her heritage. Indian half-breeds weren't welcome many places. Her biggest hope was to blend in somewhere, a place where no one might notice her looks or guess why her hair was so dark. She sighed and focused back on the paper. It was the massive font that caught her eyes, and then the listings below, all of which had different locations. Mail order brides needed. She stared at the locations, unsure of where any of them were. Each one had a short explanation of what the groom was looking for, and what the groom himself was like. She wondered if they were true descriptions of each person. There was no telling if they were genuine. The one that caught her attention the most was one written by a girl on behalf of her father. It said that her mother had passed away. Adelia could immediately resonate with the words the girl had written. She went on to describe how her father had been sad since that day. Adelia brought her hand to her chest and sighed. The only way to know more about the situation was to reply to the advert. She inhaled deeply and placed the paper down, unsure of what she should do. But this did indeed seem like the answer to her situation. Chapter 3. Katie smiled as she retrieved the third letter sent by the woman who might join her family. Her name was Adelia, and she lived in New York. Adelia had written about how she had recently lost her mother and could understand how Katie and her family were feeling after suffering such a loss. Katie cried when she first read Adelia's letter. Out of all the women who had replied, Adelia certainly seemed like the best option. It had been difficult for Katie to go into detail about how her mother had passed, and Adelia had remained silent regarding it, which Katie could appreciate. Having to explain how and why it happened would be exhausting and upsetting. In truth, Katie didn't want to explain it to anyone. Still, she was nervous about sending for Adelia. There wasn't much to go on when just reading a letter from someone. There was no telling if she was beautiful, or if her father would fall in love with her. But she seemed kind enough, and that gave Katie the hope she needed. Adelia's kindness would hopefully resonate within her father and help ease everyone's continual pain. Katie held the envelope in her hand as she walked the path toward town. She could feel the coins jingling in her coin purse as she walked. It had been all the money she'd saved for the past 3 months for new fabric. Katie had been making clothes for herself and the twins and wanted to surprise them with new shirts. Unfortunately, it would instead be used for a train ticket. It had been one of the requirements when she'd sent out the advert for the bride. Buildings began to appear on either side of the road as she walked. She could hear the horses in the distance, pulling their carriages and wagons. Katie felt her heart flutter at the thought of bringing Adelia to Planters Point. Adelia had been candid with Katie and had told her that she'd promised her mother she would leave New York and build a new life for herself somewhere else. What better place than Planters Point, Katie thought with a smile. Katie wanted to help Adelia with that new beginning. It would be a new beginning for them all. The bell dinged the moment she opened the door of the train station. She pulled out her coin purse and placed the money on the counter to purchase a ticket for Adelia. One small movement, but it would change her world forever. Her entire family's world would be different from that moment onward. Chapter 4. Adelia received a letter from Scott, Katie's father, and Katie, confirming her ticket to Planters Point. It was happening, and not a moment too soon. She was only 3 days away from the end of her lease. She had minimal funds, and it was important that she have some left for her trip. She'd need luggage of some kind, proper clothing, and money for transportation once she was in town. The letter made her hopeful. Scott and Katie both sounded lovely, and they were understanding about her position. Katie's letter had been touching, and Scott had sent her the second letter, introducing himself and telling her it was nice to hear from her. In truth, his handwriting mirrored his daughter's on many fronts, and Adelia chuckled at the sight, wondering if Katie had taken dictation. Perhaps, her father hadn't been much for school learning. 2 days later, as she was packing, a feeling of dread came over her. It had been years since she and her mother had rented the apartment, and the place, even the furniture, was heavy with memories of their times together. To walk away was a difficult thing, especially since she was doing it alone. She was traveling to a place where she didn't know a soul, to meet a man who would soon become her spouse. The thought of it was strange and a bit unbelievable. Months ago, she would never have fathomed doing such a thing. She thought she would spend the rest of her life in New York, perhaps even working at a local business. Living in a very small town hundreds of miles away was the last thing on her mind. A small place in the middle of this vast country was not a place she saw herself living. She glanced at the letter on the table as she closed her luggage. She'd say her goodbyes to her few acquaintances. Since she was leaving tomorrow, today might be the last time she would ever see her mother's simple headstone. New York was as busy as ever. The carriage ride was bumpy as Adelia passed through the streets, heading toward the graveyard. She lifted the wildflowers up to her nose and breathed in deeply. They were her mother's favorites, as they reminded her mother of where she used to live before relocating to the city. New York was a mass of buildings and people, and it was hard to find fields of flowers. The carriage slowed to a stop and Adelia opened the door, seeing the graveyard in the distance. She gripped the bouquet close to her chest as she stepped out and hesitated. Each headstone looked like the next, but she knew exactly where they'd placed her mother. There were a few trees interspersed about, and her mother had been placed to the side of the one on the west side of the graveyard. She saw other families visiting their loved ones, even a young family with the mother crying softly next to a headstone. Mostly, it was peacefully silent throughout the graveyard, as though the sounds of New York couldn't reach that area. Adelia held out the coin for the coachman. He was a man of few words, and simply nodded when they completed the transaction. She smiled to him before turning around, already feeling the tears stinging her eyes. Now her mother would be all alone, with no one to visit her anymore. No one to lay flowers on her grave. The painful thought kept wandering through her mind. She could feel the top of the grass against her ankles as she moved toward the tree. She was overcome with emotion as she walked, feeling the heaviness in her chest weighing her down like an anchor. She knelt on the ground and placed the flowers down in front of the headstone. She looked at her mother's name and the year of her birth and her death. It had been too short, the span between the years. Much, much too short. Adelia knew that going west was her best option, but the thought of leaving gave her no joy. Her lip quivered as her choice became more real. But she had promised her mother that she would go. And that was exactly what she was going to do. Adelia had only been on a train 3 times in her life. She'd forgotten how loud they were, and how quickly they could get you from one point to another. Yet, even with the marvel of the train's speed, not only was she exhausted, but she was shaking with nervousness when she arrived in Planters Point. She wasn't sure who might meet her at the station. Was Scott kind? Was he handsome? Was he older than he let on? Would he even be there at all? Or would it be Katie? There was the chance that he and Katie had both been lying throughout their correspondence. That fear nagged at her. She had no home to go back to any longer, and she'd brought what little money she had with her, and it wasn't much. Certainly not enough to sustain her for any length of time. Adelia gathered her luggage and held it tightly as she moved through the cabin, her heart racing in her chest as the door to the train was opened by a porter. She could feel the steam from the sides of the train the moment she stepped down. She peered around the platform, watching as very few people came off the train. Obviously, Planters Point wasn't a popular destination. Not that it mattered, it would only make it easier to find Katie or Scott, whoever it was that had come to retrieve her. Despite Planters Point being a smaller town, they had a fairly sizable train station, which made Adelia wonder about the history of the town. It could be that the station was used to move produce and other goods from the farmers. She scoured the area until her eyes rested on a young teen girl who was searching the small crowd. There was no doubt in her heart that it was Katie. She simply knew it the minute she saw her. A young man was with her and Adelia bit her lips, hoping it wasn't Scott. Why, he was much, much too young. Adelia gave Katie a small wave, which caused the girl's face to light up. Katie rushed past the few families gathering with their returning loved ones, making her way to Adelia, who was still trying to avoid the steam from the train. Katie stepped to the side, closer to the wall of the station, and waited for the girl to reach her. Katie and the young man stopped in front of Adelia. She could feel the girl's eyes examining her, as though deeming whether she was worthy of her father. She desperately hoped she made a good impression. "Hello," the girl said and smiled to Adelia. "My name's Katie. This here is Jessie. You are Adelia, ain't you?" Adelia smiled softly. "I am. It's a pleasure to meet you both. Is your father here?" She watched as Katie flushed, as though embarrassed. "There are a few things I have to tell you, actually," Katie said. Jessie reached for Adelia's luggage and Katie went on, "We'll talk about it on the way to the ranch." "Wait till you see it, Adelia. I think you'll really like it there." Adelia fell silent, unsure of what to make of the news. The last thing she wanted was to be conned, yet she had a sudden unsure feeling, which she resolutely shoved aside. She had no choice but to follow the girl as she led the way across the platform. This girl was Adelia's only hope for a future in this strange and new place. It was clear that Jessie and Katie were interested in each other in a romantic way. Adelia thought it was somewhat sweet, and she was glad that Katie had been able to find someone. Adelia's suspicions relaxed once they were in the wagon. Katie seemed completely sincere. Adelia glanced again at the young couple. She herself had never had the opportunity to meet someone in her youth. Adelia had always hoped that she would, but it had never happened. Whenever the young men found out about her ancestry, things turned bad. Sometimes, she was questioned as to why she even existed. There was a deep intolerance for her flattened features and dark hair the moment their origin was discovered. Often, what was considered beautiful before, was then considered ugly and shameful. Katie bit her lip as the wagon continued down the road. "It's been real difficult for me to picture you. You're different than how I thought you'd look." Adelia grabbed at the fabric of her gray dress, unsure if she was properly dressed for the occasion. She was, after all, meeting the man who would hopefully become her spouse. Would Katie think that she hadn't tried hard enough? And how would her future husband react? Would he think she was ugly? Adelia hadn't considered herself a great beauty, but she knew she wasn't terrible to look at. And she wasn't of a mind to share her heritage. At least, not right away. She'd had enough experiences with that. "By this eve, you'll meet my father, Scott. I must admit that I lied to you a little, Adelia. He didn't write you any letters." "I wrote them." Adelia took in a sharp breath. "What?" "I wrote them all. I wanted you to be a surprise for my father," she said, her smile growing a bit tremulous. "But, don't worry. Please. I have no doubt that he'll be right happy to meet you." Adelia's entire body felt faint with nervousness. He didn't know she was coming? Oh, dear Lord. So, it was as she feared. She'd been lied to. By the man's daughter, no less. There was no doubt in her mind that he would be shocked. Would he even accept her into his home? She would be left on the road, with nowhere to go. She wasn't even sure if she had enough money to purchase a train ticket back to New York. The only hope was that there would be a place nearby she could afford for a few days, and then perhaps work her way back. The sun had already begun to set, illuminating the woods and farmland around them with a reddish hue. The sky was lined with tangerine-colored streaks. The sound of crickets had started, ushering in the early evening. "I'm sorry to ask, Katie, but why would you lie to me? Why not let your pa know about what you were doing?" "Well, Jessie and I," she said, pointing to Jessie, who was at the reins. "We intend on getting married when we have an opportunity to do so, but I can't leave the ranch with my father being the way he is. He barely notices the twins, and I don't want them to grow up without someone there for them." Adelia sighed. "I understand that, but you do understand that you've put me in a difficult position. It's going to be very hard having your father see reason when you've lied to not only me, but him, as well. I don't want you to worry, Adelia. I'll make sure this will all work out," Katie told her, her smile wide. "You just wait and see." Adelia's heart thrashed in her chest. Having learned that she'd been lied to was enough to make her want to jump off the wagon and run down the dusty road back to town. She only prayed that Scott was the kind of man who was understanding. That way, at the very least, she would have a roof over her head that evening. The ranch was unlike anything Adelia had imagined back in New York. She'd tried the entire train journey to imagine what kind of place the Kitson's ranch was. But this surpassed every image she'd created. It was lush with a partially surrounding green forest and long pastures stretching out into the distance, illuminated by the last vestiges of sunlight. She could see cows grazing far away, alongside horses at the other end of the field. A small fence surrounded the property, showing just how large it was. She didn't expect it to be so vast. The house at the end of the path was also larger than she'd anticipated. She wasn't sure what to make of her new surroundings. It seemed too good to be true. Of course, she had no idea how much ranchers made each year. She wasn't even sure exactly how they made their money. Maybe by breeding horses and cows? Her eyes widened as the wagon rolled down the path and toward the house. There she saw two small blonde children on the steps leading up to the brown house. They were both kicking their legs against the wooden porch. Her heart sank, knowing that they were being somewhat ignored by their father. How could anyone ignore them? Even in the fading light, she could see that they were both adorable, reminding her of porcelain dolls. The wagon came to a stop, and Adelia was both eager and nervous to jump down. The ride hadn't exactly been smooth. The dirt roads around Planters Point were worn and gutted, which had caused the wagon ride to be extremely bumpy. She wouldn't be surprised if she later found bruises all up her legs and against her back. She could already feel small points of pain from the journey. But on top of her soreness, there was the bigger issue facing her. "Katie," the young boy cried, leaping onto his feet. "You're back. We picked blueberries." Adelia stepped down from the wagon, leaning against the back of it. Her legs felt as though they would collapse after such a bumpy ride. She watched as Katie jumped down with ease and took both of the twins into her arms. "There's someone very special I want you to meet," Katie told them, turning to Adelia. "This is Adelia, and she'll be staying with us a while." Katie had not only kept Adelia a secret from her father, but also the twins. Of course, they were awfully young. They wouldn't yet understand the reason for her being there. They might even grow sullen if they knew she was there to replace their mother. "Hi, Adelia," the young girl said, squishing a patch of grass with her foot. "My name is Emily, and this is my brother Luke." Adelia smiled softly at them both, feeling her nerves easing at the sweetness of them. "Hello, there. It's nice to meet both of you. You must be tired from all that blueberry picking. We picked a whole bunch. You want to see?" Emily asked. Adelia brought her eyes to Katie, who nodded to her. "All right," Adelia said, and put out both of her hands for them to take. "Take me along, and I'll have a look." Chapter 5. Those darn dogs were still on the loose. Scott knew they weren't wolves. He always heard their barking at midday, and by the time he rushed out into the fields, they were gone. And they'd taken down a calf and one of his smaller cows, ripped them to shreds and taken off. It had been a long day of trying to track them down, and he'd yet to find out where they were holing up. He hated the idea of having to deal with them, but he couldn't continue to allow them to terrorize his herd. Any more of this, and he'd begin to lose too many. Cows weren't exactly known for having great self-preservation skills. They often ran right into the jaws of danger. Scott stretched, feeling the weight of the frustration dragging him down. He continued down the path toward the house with his rifle resting against his shoulder. Night had already arrived, and the sky was clear and full of stars twinkling like gems. He could hear the cows in the distance and prayed that they would be all right throughout the night. Hopefully, those wild dogs were full up from their escapades that morning. He could see that the porch lamp was on and just below it sat Katie. He narrowed his eyes at her, wondering why on God's green earth she wasn't inside with the twins. It was almost time to be getting them ready for bed. He'd already let her know that he would be tracking the dogs, which meant that getting the twins to bed was her job that evening. Though, if he were to admit it to himself, it was her job near every evening. He brought the rifle to his side as he neared her. "Where are the twins?" The expression on Katie's face seemed as though she were guilty of something. He felt a quick pang in his stomach and knew full well that it was his own guilt. He didn't mean to put so much pressure on her. But he had no idea how to bring the words together to tell her that, so he remained silent. "The twins are inside, Pa," she said, and stepped down the stairs to meet him. "There's something I need to tell you." Her tone had shifted, and so he waited. Whatever it was, it seemed important. He wondered if the time had finally come for Jessie to propose to her. "I did something without telling you, and I know you might be vexed with me," she said, her voice wavering. "I went ahead and paid for a mail-order bride for you. She's inside right now with the twins." Scott laughed lightly. "That's real funny, Katie." She brought her eyes to his. "I'm serious, Pa. Her name is Adelia, and she's from New York." Scott stared at her, his mouth agape. His daughter had never gone behind his back and done anything of this sort. He couldn't believe she'd done such a thing. Anger rose in his chest as he dropped the rifle on the ground. "You better be kiddin' with me, Katie girl. This ain't funny. At all." She lifted her hands between them, her expression crestfallen. "It's for the best, Pa. We need someone around here to help with the twins. At the very least, let her do that." "You actually went behind my back and did such a thing?" he asked, his tone sharp. He nodded, his hands on his hips. "That woman's out of here by tomorrow. I don't want to hear another word about it. I can't believe you'd not tell me this. I'm sorely disappointed in you." He felt terrible the moment he saw the tears in his daughter's eyes, but she should have known better than to play such games. Especially when it came to his life. It wasn't some small thing like bringing a kitten home. There was a woman who'd been promised his hand in marriage. How could Katie possibly think he'd be all right with such deception? He snatched the rifle off the ground and walked into his home, where he could immediately hear the twins laughing. He stepped out past the entryway and peered into the dining room, where he saw the woman sitting with the twins at the table. She had long dark hair and flattened features. Despite this, Scott couldn't deny that she was quite beautiful. Adelia created an image with her hands, which showed up as a shadow on the wall behind her, causing the twins to gasp in awe. He smiled lightly, glad to see that they were amused. He exhaled a long, drawn-out breath. He couldn't see himself marrying again. Not after losing his wife and the mother of his children. Not even with this pretty woman. After much consideration, which he'd thought of deep into the night, Scott decided to confront Adelia with the truth of it. They'd all managed to make it through the night before without coming to any conclusions. Scott had dismissed himself right quick, trusting Katie to show Adelia to the spare room. But he couldn't continue to put things off. He put on his work shirt and stepped out from his bedroom. There was a hush to the house. No doubt after his reaction or non-reaction, Adelia was packed up and ready to leave. Scott descended the stairs and neared the dining room. It was early enough in the morning that the twins hadn't woken up yet, and Katie was likely preparing breakfast. Scott decided that he would allow Adelia to stay for a short time and see how she got along with the family. He wasn't ready for a wife, but the twins did need someone to be with them. It was no secret that he'd been too busy with the ranch to spend a lot of time taking care of the twins and nurturing them the way he should. And he couldn't count on Katie forever. He knew Jessie was sweet on her. He stepped into the dining room and saw Adelia sitting at the table. She had a mug in her hands and was gazing out the window. Scott cleared his throat and Adelia nearly jumped out of her chair at the sight of him. There was no doubt in his mind that Katie had relayed his grim response to his daughter's news, and maybe even embellished it a little, as she often did. "Adelia, I was hopin' to talk to you one-on-one, if you don't mind." He could see that she was nervous, but she forced a smile. Her eyes were on him like a mouse to a cat, watching every one of his movements and waiting. "Did you sleep all right?" Adelia took another sip of her tea, and he could see the cup shaking in her hands. "Yes, I did. Thank you. I wanted to apologize for not being a very good host last night. I didn't react the way I should have, as you might understand. My daughter, it seems, lied to us both about this here ordeal." Adelia nodded. "Well, as you know, my name's Scott Kitson, and although I can't say I'm ready to marry any woman, I would be happy to take you on as hired help. I need someone around here to see to the twins. I saw the three of you gettin' along well last evenin', and I'd like for you to stick around, maybe teach them how to read and write proper, if you want. I'm not sure what to think, Mr. Kitson. I was a little surprised at being lied to, as well. I understand if you want to head home. I can pay for your ticket out of here," he told her, feeling good about his choice. "It's the least I could do. Can you give me until the end of the day to consider it?" "Of course. Take your time," he said, and pushed out his chair. Against all odds, he found himself hoping she'd agree. Having her around would take the pressure off of him. "Just come find me out in the pastures when you've made up your mind." Chapter 6. It had been 2 weeks since Adelia had started working for Scott. It wasn't at all what she'd expected when she left New York, but she'd fulfilled her promise to her mother. The pay wasn't terrible, and she was given a nice room of her own. The ranch was quiet most days, save for the barking of a pack of wild dogs that seemed to harass the cattle and drive Scott mad. But despite this, Adelia was enjoying herself. She'd never taught anyone to read and write before, but the twins were quick learners. They had a good memory for the words that Katie had already taught them, and they picked everything up rather quickly. They were well-mannered, and made almost no trouble for Adelia, which was the opposite of what she'd heard from people who had their own children. Overall, her experience so far on the ranch had been pleasant. It was slowly beginning to feel like home. Still, there was the shadow of the children's mother always haunting the hearts of those that lived in the house. Adelia could see that shadow looming over Mr. Kitson regularly. By the way he walked, it was apparent enough that he was often sad. He couldn't be too old, but he appeared to have aged over the years since his wife's death. Even though Adelia didn't agree that Katie should have lied to get help around the home, she could see why the girl had been so desperate. One thing Adelia appreciated about her new home was that there was constant food. Not only did the property have a lovely garden that Katie had been tending, but it also had cows, which meant meat for many meals. They often had steak, as well as eggs from the chickens in the coop near the house. She'd never had the opportunity to make so many rich meals. Adelia discovered that she could remember most of her mother's old recipes. It was gratifying to think of her mother, and the promise that she was keeping. Scott saw Adelia and the twins running through the pastures together. He couldn't tell exactly what they were playing, but she was chasing them, and they were taking turns reaching out and tagging one another. He smiled upon seeing them, having noticed a significant change in his children since Adelia had entered their home. Keeping her on had been a wise decision, one he wouldn't regret. Katie was out gathering food from the garden for dinner. Scott stepped down from the porch and made his way toward her, noticing that she was inspecting each potato and carrot as though it were a diamond. He was glad to see that his former wife's love of gardening had been passed down to their daughter. They hadn't spoken much since Adelia had arrived, and Scott knew that he was fully to blame. He was never good with speaking to his daughter, as he found that he disappointed her more often than he was able to help her. "Katie, can I have a word with you?" She inspected the potato in her hand and placed it in the basket next to her. He couldn't help but smile when he saw that the bottom of her blue dress was riddled with dirt, just as her mother's always had been. She got to her feet and took the basket into her hand. He could tell that she was still apprehensive around him, since having deceived him, indeed, deceived them all. Adelia and Katie had already resolved their issues, as far as he could tell. This knowledge pushed Scott to want to make amends. The tension couldn't go on forever. "Is everything all right?" she asked, wary. He nodded softly. "Everything is fine, sweetheart. But there's something I need to say to you, because I know that we've been having a tough time with each other lately. I want you to know that I'm sorry for the way I've been acting. She looked surprised at his words. "It's all right, Pa. Not just about Adelia. With everything. I know it must have been hard taking care of the twins all alone after your mother passed." He let out a deep breath, already feeling uneasy. "I've been neglecting my duties toward you three, and I can see now just how it's affected you and the twins. I'm real sorry for it all." Scott took a step forward when he saw Katie drop the basket and rush toward him. Tears were streaming down her face as she hugged her father close. It had been the first point of close contact between the two in way too long, and Scott felt as though, for the first time in a long time, he'd done something right. "I can't promise I'll marry her, you know. It was wrong of you to go behind my back like that," he told her, holding her close. "But Adelia's a good woman, and I'm happy with her staying for as long as she likes. I only did it because I want to see you happy again," Katie said into his shirt, muffling her voice. "The way you were with Ma." He rubbed her back as she squeezed harder. "I can't promise that I'll ever be like I was before your mother passed. But I can promise you that I'll try harder." Chapter 7. Scott crossed his arms, trying to take in what Jessie had just said. If he denied Jessie his blessing, it would only lead to Katie being heartbroken. He rubbed his finger along his bottom lip and stared at the nervous young man in front of him. He'd known for a long time that this moment would come, but now that it had, he realized he was hoping to stave it off. It made him realize just how much older Katie had grown, and how she'd blossomed into a young woman before he was truly ready. The sun was beating down on them from above and there was a warm breeze passing between them. Scott could see his daughter at the window, watching as he and Jessie spoke. Jessie was fidgeting with his hands in front of him, holding the little box that held the ring he'd purchased for Katie. There was no denying that Jessie was a good man and that he worked hard for what he had. There was a disparity between their incomes, but Scott knew that Jessie would do his best to take care of his little girl. "Now, I know this must be hard for you to ask of me, but you also know that I think you're a good young man, Jessie. You and my daughter have been friends since you were little, and I've known long before even you did, that this would come about one day." "Yes, sir. I've loved Katie for a long time. I want you to know that I'll treat her right, and I'll do my best to make sure she's happy." Scott reminisced about the moment when he'd asked Carolyn's father for her hand in marriage. He'd wanted nothing more than the old man's blessing. He was, after all, a hard man who had a very beautiful daughter. Scott hadn't been the only one who had asked him for the honor of marrying his daughter. He just happened to be the favored one. Adelia could immediately tell that there was a tension in the air. She saw Katie sitting up against the window, staring intently out toward the pasture from the dining room. Adelia took a sip of her tea and stood next to Katie, only to see Jessie and Scott having a conversation. It didn't look as though it was going too well. "Are you all right?" Katie turned to Adelia with an air of desperation. "I don't know. Jessie's asking for my father's blessing. I hope he sees reason." Adelia smiled softly. She could only imagine how Katie must feel in that moment. Having the love of her life hanging in the wind before her, unsure of whether they'd be together. It had to be distressing. "I don't think you have to worry, Katie. Jesse's a sweet young man, and your father has known him for a long time. I'm sure he'll let the two of you be together." There was silence as Katie placed her hands against the windowpane, staring out as the two men spoke. Adelia placed her free hand on Katie's shoulder, and felt how tense she was. She wanted to help relieve that fear, but she'd said her piece. Katie remained silent and pushed herself from the window. Adelia could see that both men had finished talking and were heading toward the door. Even Adelia felt nervous, hoping that everything would work out. Her esteem for Scott would fall a notch or two if he wouldn't allow his daughter to marry the young man she loved so dearly. Jesse walked in first, his expression revealing just how nervous he was. Adelia couldn't help but cover her mouth with her hand, trying not to cause the young man to grow self-conscious. Scott was smiling, which gave Adelia hope that he'd given the young man his blessing. She could see the love in Jesse's eyes as he looked at Katie. He moved to her without so much as a word and took the box from the front pocket of his brown pants. Jesse was beaming as he held it out to Katie, whose hands were covering her mouth. "Katie," he said, tears filling his eyes, "I've loved you for so long, it's hard to remember a moment when I didn't have this feeling. I want to continue loving you for the rest of our lives. Will you do me the honor of being my wife?" Katie burst into tears as he opened the box, revealing a small gold band. Adelia had to press her hand against her chest, feeling as though her heart was going to burst. Katie kept nodding, unable to say a word. Adelia was glad that Scott had given his blessing, and that she was there to witness the couple express their love for each other. Adelia wondered what it was like to fall so deeply in love with someone that she'd want to spend the rest of her life alongside that person. It had to be wonderful. She found herself smiling from ear to ear, excited for the overjoyed couple. Katie rushed into Jesse's arms immediately after he placed the band on her wedding finger. Adelia peered over to Scott, noticing that he was overcome with emotion as well. It was the softest expression she'd seen from him since she'd moved into the house. Jesse pulled back from Katie and turned to Scott, then Adelia. "I'd like to take everyone out to dinner in town. I've got nothing pressing, and I think this deserves a celebration," Scott said, then brought his eyes to Adelia's. "You should join us, of course." "Oh, I wouldn't want to impose on a family outing." Katie turned to Adelia, smiling as tears streamed down her face. "I want you to come with us. It wouldn't be the same without you." "If you insist," Adelia said, feeling her heart flutter at being invited by the entire family. "I'll be happy to join you." "Thank you." Jesse kept Katie in his arms as he brought his attention to Scott. "What do you think of going to the hotel for a meal, and then heading to the dance hall? It's been a real long time since Katie and I have danced. If that's what you kids want to do, it's fine by me." Jesse rubbed Katie's back, and it felt as though the room were bursting with excitement. There was so much love in the room that Adelia couldn't help but want to have those emotions for herself. She promised herself that she would mentally bottle the moment and cherish it. She knew her mother would have been happy to see her amidst such a wonderful scene. Adelia felt weighed down by the food as they walked the main street, heading toward the dance hall at the other end of town. The meal had been wonderful, and Jesse had made a point to pay for the entire thing. The town was silent, save for the music emanating from the building ahead. She wondered how the twins were, back at the ranch with one of the helpers on the farm watching over them. She hoped that they were being put to bed with a good story and feeling comfortable. It was the first night since she'd arrived that she hadn't been the one there for them at bedtime. The sun was beginning to set, and the shops along the main street were closing. There was hardly a soul around, and Adelia rather enjoyed it. In New York, it had felt as though the city never slept. She couldn't remember a time when the city had fallen completely silent. There were always people wandering the streets and wagons passing. The sound of horses and voices were always prominent. The quietness of Planters Point was welcome. She couldn't help but wonder if her mother had enjoyed such solitude while living in the countryside with her father, back when he was still alive. It had been the need to find work that had caused them to move to New York shortly after Adelia was born. Her father had died not too long after from a terrible illness that left him bedridden for over a month. "Do you enjoy dancing, Adelia?" Adelia blinked and brought her eyes to Katie, who was walking ahead of her and Scott, all while holding hands with Jesse. "I don't mind it. Haven't danced in years, though." Scott laughed next to her. "I've always been awful at dancing." No, you aren't awful, Pa, Katie said, smiling. I remember you and Ma dancing in the kitchen. You looked like a fine dancer, even back then. That was without music. Once I hear music, I get all disoriented. It's hard to keep up with all the steps. The building ahead reminded Adelia of a barn. She inhaled deeply, preparing herself for the huge number of people she could see through the windows. The music resonated in the air around them. She hadn't met many of the people who lived in Planters Point. It would be the first time that she'd been out in public with the family. Katie ran up ahead and opened the door to the dance hall. The instrumental music was loud, and the crowd was thick. Adelia was surprised by the amount of people in the town who had gone out that evening. She hadn't thought Planters Point had such a young population either. She could see young couples and children with their parents, all dancing together. I'm going to head onto the dance floor with Jessie, Katie said, twirling in her long light blue dress. I'll see you later, Pa. Jessie took Katie by the hand and led her further into the room. The sound of feet against the old wood floors echoed up toward the high ceiling. Adelia saw that there were stairs and a loft above, for those who wanted to watch the dancing from on high. She stood awkwardly, unsure of what to do with herself. It was just her and Scott now, with Katie and Jessie having gone off to celebrate their engagement. She could see Katie, stopping here and there, already showing off her ring to her friends, who were clearly ecstatic at the news. Adelia turned to Scott, who was also watching his daughter pass through the crowd with Jessie. She looks really happy, Adelia said and smiled softly at Scott. I can only imagine how proud you are of her right now. Scott chuckled, albeit wistfully. I'm proud, sure. But I'm also terrified. That's my baby, and she's all grown up. I no longer have a say in her future from here on out. She'll leave the house and have children of her own. I'm not sure if I'm quite ready. I guess it happens quickly. Too fast, if you ask me. He turned to Adelia. By the by, do you dance? Adelia's face flushed at the thought. It's like I told Katie. I haven't danced in years. Well, we should give it a try, he told her, and held out his hand. You can't be any worse than me, after all. Adelia brought her eyes to his hand. She hadn't had much physical contact with Scott up until that point, and she wasn't sure if dancing with him was breaching any boundaries of her working for him. Still, denying him a dance might be worse. She took his hand and he led her out onto the dance floor. She felt as though her heart was beating to the cheerful music the band at the front of the dance hall played. The music slowed, and the other couples switched positions for a slow dance. Scott's hands touched hers and she felt her face flush. She caught the smell of his cologne. It was mixed with the soft scent of hay, which had now become a welcoming thing. It reminded her of the Kitson Ranch. So, when was the last time you danced? Scott raised his eyes to Adelia's and gave her a small smile. The last time I danced was in the kitchen back at the ranch. With my wife. The way he spoke about his wife was heartfelt. Sometimes, he mentioned her as though she were still alive. I hope I'm not so bad that you regret me being the first dance after her, then, Adelia said, lowering her voice. Thank you, by the way, for inviting me to come along tonight. It ain't nothing, Adelia. You're part of the family now. It was a strange, but welcome feeling that overcame her. She'd thought for sure that when her mother passed away, she'd never find another family to embrace her. I'm very happy to hear that. The song was sweet and soft, and there was a spark in Scott's eye that caught her by surprise, even more so than him having asked her to dance. Silence passed between them, their eyes locking, even while they moved slowly to the music. There's something else, Adelia. I know why you came here, and I've given it some consideration. There's certainly something. Between us, I mean. The music ended for the next song and Adelia glanced down to her hands, which Scott still held in his. His hands were warm against her skin as they remained silent, her heart pattering in her chest. What was he going to say? Was there hope for them actually becoming sweethearts? Her breath caught in her throat when she realized how much she would like that. I agree. Scott. I didn't know you'd be here tonight. Scott let go of Adelia's hands, and both of them turned to see the young woman approaching them. She was the epitome of what Adelia had imagined all Southern belles looked like. Soft, blonde hair gathered in a braid that lowered toward her light blue dress, and blue eyes that reminded Adelia of the sky. She was everything Adelia wasn't but had always wished to be. "Hello, Sarah," Scott said, placing his hands into his pockets. "What are you doing here?" "Well, the same as you. I'm here to dance." "And who's this lovely lady?" Her words were sweet, but the look in her eyes told a different story. Something in her tone caused Adelia to take a step back. It was clear that this young woman had a distaste for her and was examining her as though she were an unsightly burr under someone's saddle. "This here's my new housekeeper. She's been helping the twins with their reading, cooking dinner, and keeping the place cleaner than I ever did." "Well, it's a pleasure to meet you. I'm Sarah." "My name's Adelia." "Glad to meet you, as well." Sarah stared into Adelia's eyes as they both curtsied. It was more of a glare, which Scott didn't seem to notice. Adelia lowered her gaze, not wanting to feel as though she were someone's prey. "Well, I was wondering if you'd like to dance with me, Scott." Scott appeared taken aback by Sarah's abruptness. "I just finished dancing, but I suppose another dance wouldn't hurt none. If you'll excuse me, Adelia. I'll be back shortly." "Thank you for allowing me the opportunity to dance with you, Scott." "I'm sorry for stealing him away, Adelia," Sarah said, still eyeing her, now with a look of gloating. "Oh, and nice to meet you." Adelia wasn't given the opportunity to reply. Sarah was already swirling away. There was something about the way Sarah had scrutinized her that caused her hands to shake. It was a look Adelia had seen before, and it had always come with danger. She watched from the side of the room as Scott and Sarah danced, finding it difficult to bear the sight of them. Adelia wondered how Scott would feel about her native roots. If they were revealed, would he hate her? The fragile connection they'd made might fall apart like a thread holding up a heavy piece of fabric. She sighed, turning back toward the entrance. She needed a breath of fresh air, and to get the sight of Scott and Sarah dancing out of her mind. Chapter 8. The sound of the crickets outside echoed right into the house. Adelia continued to shift in bed, unable to rid herself of uneasiness she felt for not sharing her heritage with Scott more clearly. There was a knot in her stomach that she was unable to shed. Confusion filled her. What exactly was her obligation to share her ancestry with her employer? She cringed. Scott was more than her employer, wasn't he? At least, in her heart. She pushed herself upright and brought her gaze to the window, which overlooked the expansive woods beyond the ranch. She could hear the sound of cattle mooing in the distance, as they always did throughout the evening. It had become nothing more than background noise. At that moment, however, it was deafening. She wanted nothing more than to find a secluded, silent place, where she could spend some time alone to think. Adelia swung her feet from beneath the covers. The wood floor was cool against her feet as she stood. She tiptoed through her room, doing her best not to make any noise that might awaken the others. Even being as careful as she could, it was frustrating, as each step caused the old wooden floor to creak. She carefully opened her door and left it open as she entered the hallway. Moonlight was trickling in through the windows. She could still hear the distant lowing of the cows out in the pasture and in the stable. She was silent as she made her way down the stairs. Her mind was still racing with the burden of her secret. Yet, in all fairness, she hadn't truly considered it a secret until day after day went by without her mentioning it. And if she neglected to mention it on purpose, being afraid of rejection for her Indian roots, didn't that make it a secret? There was nothing more she wanted than to stare at the stars and ease her mind of her persistent thoughts. She breathed softly, holding on to the banister so that her weight wasn't causing the floor to squeak beneath her feet. There was something about the night sky that always helped her relax. Every time she had difficulty falling asleep, even back in the city, she would go outside and peer at the stars. Their apartment building had contained a small garden in the back where she could sit outside and enjoy the night sky. She opened the front door slowly and carefully. Adelia brought her shawl closer to her body and stepped outside, enjoying the solitude of the evening. The breeze felt as though it swept completely through her as she stood out on the porch, overlooking the fields. The sky from the ranch seemed even more beautiful than when she was in the city. There was something expansive about it, and the stars seemed even more visible. She jumped when there was a cough from the end of the porch. She was surprised to find Scott there, leaning against the wall. "What brings you out here?" Adelia shrugged, unsure how to respond. It had been a long time since she'd been alone with a man in the dark. Every other time had been coming back from the theater, or from a trip just outside of the city. "I couldn't sleep, so I thought I'd come out and enjoy the stars." Scott gave her a small smile which she could see even in the dark. "I see you're a fan of the night sky. I always come out here when I can't sleep. Always gives me a sense of peace. Sometimes, the cows make sleeping a little difficult." He chuckled softly. "They do that from time to time. Especially when a few of them are held up in the barn." "Do you leave the doors open for them to wander about?" "Those dogs have made it so I keep all of them corralled at night, as best I can. Usually there's a few stragglers, but once I'm on my horse and herding them, they know to start heading home." Adelia pursed her lips. "It's awful. The dogs, I mean. Never would have thought they would attack cows. The difference in their size makes it seem impossible to me. I tried to imagine it when I first got here but couldn't figure out how they could take a cow down. They'll attack anything when they have no other option. You get enough of them out there, and they'll take just about anything down. They act like wolves, really. If you've ever heard how wolves take down large animals like cattle, then you'd know," he said, his tone sharp with the thought. "They circle the animal and bite at the ankles. It's awful." Adelia flinched as Scott pushed himself off the wall and made his way toward her. She could hear the wind sweeping over the trees, causing the leaves to rustle against one another. Aside from that, there was silence, as though the world around her had stopped. "Anyway, that's not the kind of conversation a lady should have," he said, and let out a deep breath. "I think we should talk a little more about that conversation we had over at the dance hall. It ain't a big deal or anything, but I think it would be best if we discussed it." She felt her heart skip a beat. Adelia wasn't sure if she should continue exploring their connection. She hadn't been truthful with him regarding her background, and she had learned the hard way that it was deeply important to some people. Was Scott one of those people? Was she ready to admit that she was part Indian? "I enjoy your company, Scott. I'm just not sure if it's best that we. I mean." She held her breath as he took another step closer. There was a glow in his eyes that made her stomach knot, making her feel as though her entire body was tightened. He took her hand in his, just as he'd done at the dance hall, and moved closer. He lowered his lips toward hers. A warmth filled her stomach as his soft lips touched hers, unraveling the knots that had been there just seconds earlier. A flame was being ignited, luring her closer. He pulled away and smiled at her. "We'll discuss it another time, then. When you're ready." She nodded slowly and watched as he walked away. Her heart raced, and her cheeks warmed at the mere thought of his kiss. She was left to the silence of the night, wondering if she was dreaming. Chapter 9. Focusing on work was proving difficult. Each time Scott thought he was in the clear, his thoughts would turn. The sensation of kissing Adelia was like a mark that was etched forever on his lips. He kept reminiscing of the night before, enjoying the feeling of her warmth against him. There was no doubt in his mind that she'd become special to him in ways that he wouldn't have guessed when she'd first come. Scott inhaled deeply and grabbed another mound of hay, lifting it by the rope that held it together. The cattle were far out into the pasture, providing him with a silence that was well needed after the previous night. Guilt formed in his chest. He could imagine his late wife watching him from every side of the barn. He'd turn around and swear he could see her with her arms crossed and shaking her head. It had been difficult enough to face Adelia in the morning. It was even harder to imagine his wife's distraught expression. He knew that he'd let his passion overcome him. There was no denying any longer that he and Adelia had a connection. Still, it felt as though he were letting his wife down. It had been the reason he couldn't so much as look at another woman. He, after all, hadn't been there when their ranch was attacked by Indians. He gripped the rope hard enough with his hand that it burned. He needed to feel that pain. Every time he imagined the world of pain Carolyn had gone through, it churned his stomach and made him want to destroy everything around him. He inhaled deeply and decided to let the minutes pass as they always did. He'd do his best to distance himself a little and gather his bearings once again. There was no sense in forcing anything with Adelia, nor explaining things to Adelia right away. She hadn't been too keen on discussing anything the previous night, anyway. Scott wiped the sweat from his forehead and decided to just keep working. That's what had always saved him in the past. It would save him again, so long as he kept moving. Somehow Sarah Hooton had convinced her father to check on the woman who was staying at the Kitson Ranch. It was necessary, as far as Sarah was concerned. Evil and sneaky? Maybe a little. But there was something about Adelia's face that made her uneasy. Those flat features, those high cheekbones and dark hair. She looked too different to be anything but Indian. Mr. Wilkinson, the man who'd been hired to do the checking, had finally arrived at her home to deliver the news. Sarah brought a tray with 2 cups of tea. She placed the tray onto the table and pulled out a chair across from him, eager to hear his report. This report had cost a little money, but it would be worth it. Scott had enough money to allow her to live comfortably for the rest of her life. He was one of the few men in Planters Point who had that kind of financial security. She couldn't let some woman come out of nowhere and steal him from her. Sarah had put far too much work into building a solid foundation between her and Scott. Never mind having to deal with that teenage daughter of his, who was always glaring at her. It was a relief when she heard Katie was being married off. It only made things easier. Mr. Wilkinson adjusted his glasses and took his time blowing on the tea. His sideburns stretched low on his face, nearly blending in with his droopy, thick white mustache. He reminded Sarah of a relic found in old caves. "So, Miss Hooton, I have the news you were looking for. Pray tell, what were you able to find?" Sarah knew she had to act innocent in her interactions with Mr. Wilkinson. She hardly wanted this interchange to go further than the 4 walls they sat within. In her opinion, Mr. Wilkinson was a simpleton, albeit one who could ferret out juicy news. He thought Sarah was only trying to find out if she and Adelia were long-lost relations. He was such a fool. Sarah had ulterior motives, all of which he didn't need to know. "You ain't related." "Couldn't be as far as I can see," he said, taking a long sip of his tea and letting out a deep breath. "She's half Indian. Was able to get into contact with the mail-order bride agency she used. Turns out there was a classified that was sent out all across our great country. She's from New York. Traveled pretty far to get here, I'd reckon." Sarah used every bit of her will not to let out a gasp. She pressed her lips tightly together and then said, "I see. And, is that all?" "Yes." Well, thank you for that information. Do you think Scott Kitson knows about all this bride business?" "Not sure, really. Hard to say," the old fool said, and placed the teacup down onto its saucer. "I don't think he'd let a half-Indian woman into his home after what happened to his wife, though. Seems a bit odd to me." "It certainly does. It's just terrible, if she didn't tell him." "Well, it's not my place to say, but I still don't think he'd likely let her into his home on that there ranch," he said, his lips growing thin. "It's a shame, if she did lie to him to get under his roof." "I couldn't agree more," Sarah said, her mind still whirling. Never in her wildest dreams did she expect mail-order bride news. She stood up, wanting him out of the house. She had some serious planning to do. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Wilkinson." He held out his hand across the table. "Now, then, a man has got to eat, you know. I don't do nothin' for free, so I'd like my payment now." She smiled to him, eager to see him gone. Thank goodness, he hadn't asked her any further questions as to her motives. All right, sir. I'll get your payment for you right away. Chapter 10. Helping Katie prepare for her wedding was a welcome distraction. Adelia gathered the last of the wildflowers and placed them on the table. They would make lovely bouquets for both the bride and for the decorations. Adelia lifted her eyes as the front door opened and Kate entered. Adelia. Come on with me. I'm heading into town to go see the dress. I just received word from the seamstress that she's finished the alterations. Adelia smiled softly, excited to step out into the fresh air again. Let's go, then. I can't wait to see it. Let me make sure the twins are still asleep, and then ask one of the hands to listen for them. Katie waited for Adelia to grab her cape and make arrangements for the children. Then the two women walked out of the house and toward town. It was a slightly long walk, but Adelia was excited to stretch her legs. It had been too long since she'd been in town. My father spared no expense on my dress, Katie told her as they made their way down the main dirt road that led into town. I know that you'll just adore it when you see it. There's lace everywhere, and even a long frill toward the front. It sounds rather fancy. Maybe you can borrow it when you and my father marry. Adelia's cheeks flushed at the thought. Katie, no. Don't say that. Your father made himself clear from the beginning. Katie didn't know about the kiss, and Adelia had made sure not to tell her. It would only further complicate things. Scott had barely spoken to her since that night and, although Adelia couldn't help but wonder why, she knew not to pry. The man was always preoccupied and often went straight to work the moment he awoke. They hadn't broached the subject of their relationship again, and Adelia knew it was better that she wasn't the one to do it. I've seen the way you two look at each other. I think it's possible, Adelia. Please tell me you're at least open to it now that you know him. Please. Katie, no one has told me how your mother died. I'm afraid to ask Scott. Was she ill? Katie blanched, her face turning pale. I'm sorry, Adelia said quickly. I shouldn't have asked. My mother was ill and died. I know how awful it can be. She wasn't sick. Katie stopped and took a breath. I don't like to talk about it. You don't have to, Adelia said, sorry now that she'd asked. She wasn't sick, Katie repeated. It was Indians. The Lakota got her. Please don't ask me the details. Adelia's heart froze and she stopped walking. Katie turned to her. It was a long time ago. It's over now. Come on. This is supposed to be a happy day for me. I get to see my dress again. Adelia felt sick. She swallowed hard, trying to stem the nausea in her throat. Indians? She'd been killed by Indians? Oh, dear Lord, no. This couldn't be. What would Katie think once she knew? What would Scott think? Adelia wanted desperately to admit her secret, but she didn't dare. Not now. Maybe not ever. She was terrified at how Katie might react to the news. And Scott would kick her out of his home. Adelia would be trapped in Planter's Point with nothing but the clothes on her back. The savings she'd managed to gather during her stay at the Kitson Ranch weren't nearly enough to survive on. And no one would want her in Planter's Point once they knew, anyway. Her history was repeating itself. Her mother had been wrong. Dead wrong. This new beginning would never lead to a happy life for Adelia. Never. She couldn't give away any of her thoughts, or Katie would question her, as she always did when she saw Adelia's mood darken. You're right. This is to be a happy day for you. Forget I asked about your mother. I'm so sorry. But we can talk about you and Pa, Katie said, the twinkle returning to her eye. Adelia forced herself to act as though nothing were wrong. The twins are most important. And right now, any connection with your father comes second to my work with them at the ranch. You sound as though you're running for governor, Katie told her, laughing lightly. You shouldn't be so negative. I have no doubt that he fancies you. Adelia rolled her eyes and remained silent. At that moment, all that mattered was that Adelia kept her job. Without her job, she could wind up back in New York where she had nothing. And no one. That was the most heartbreaking thought of all. Katie pointed, and Adelia could see the building sprouting up between the trees surrounding them. The seamstress is right in between those houses. Isn't this exciting? It is wonderful, Katie. You only get married once. Adelia winced the moment the words slipped from between her lips. Not everyone got married once. In situations like Scott's, there was sometimes the option to get married twice. Not that it would ever happen with her. Not now. Not after what she just learned. Depends, Katie said solemnly. It's nice to have you here, but I do wish my ma was here to see all of this. I know she would have adored the dress. If there's ever a time that I get married, my mother won't be there either. It only reminds us of how much we miss them. Katie nodded as they neared the edge of town. I'm sure she's with the Lord, watching over all of us down here. She's probably laughing, because she always knew that Jesse and I would marry. Your mother knew Jesse? Well, we grew up together. She always said that we would marry one day, and that she couldn't wait to see what kind of man he'd grow up to be. I'm sure she'd be happy to know that we ended up together. Adelia gave Katie a smile. I'm sure she'd be very pleased. I was nervous when Jesse went ahead and asked Pa for his blessing. Even though Pa has known Jesse since he was a kid, I was scared he'd go and tell him that he wasn't good enough. Jesse doesn't have as much money as we have, but he works real hard to make a good living. I haven't seen his place. He has a farm and some cattle, most of which he purchased from my father, Katie said. She stopped at an old brick building. Its windows hadn't been cleaned in a long time, but Adelia could still make out the dresses on the wooden mannequins inside. This is it. You'll be the first person to see me in my dress. I feel quite lucky. Katie chuckled lightly and led the way into the building. Adelia followed and listened to the bell tinkle above her. The old floors creaked as they entered, and she was immediately in awe of the bolts of fabric along the tables and the dresses in the windows and behind the counter. Adelia had never seen a seamstress in a small town, and she was wholly surprised to discover that the dresses were just as attractive as the ones she'd seen in New York. Hello? Katie asked, glancing around the room for someone. She turned to Adelia and frowned. I wonder where she is. Adelia walked past Katie and made her way toward the back of the room, where there was an open door. The afternoon sunlight was barely able to stream in through the window. She could see the dress in the room on a wooden mannequin. It was the most beautiful wedding dress she'd ever seen. Katie hadn't been exaggerating in the least. It had a long train toward the back, and the lace was soft, glowing in the sunlight like dew. Katie followed in behind her with her hand over her mouth the moment she saw the dress. Adelia placed her hand on Katie's shoulder. It's just as beautiful as you said it was. Katie turned to Adelia and flashed her a wide smile. Isn't it? It's even prettier than I thought it would be. There was a creak behind the girls and both women turned around to see the seamstress, who was an aged woman with a messy bun at the top of her head. Her own dress was simple, but immaculately followed the shape of her body. Well, how about this? Such a nice surprise. You came even faster than I thought you would. I couldn't wait, Katie told the woman, still smiling from ear to ear. It's absolutely lovely. You've done an amazing job. I'm so glad to hear that. Well, you shouldn't keep all of us waiting. You want to try it on? Katie's eyes widened. Can I do that here? The woman nodded, smiling lightly. Of course, you can. There's a room just off this one that you can use. I'll fetch the dress, if you want to just go through that door over there. Thank you, Mrs. McDonough. I'll try it on now. Will you wait here, Adelia? Adelia took a seat in a chair at the corner of the room. I'm already waiting. Katie chuckled as she opened the door at the side of the room. Adelia was on the edge of her seat, waiting patiently as Mrs. McDonough moved the mannequin, bringing the dress with her carefully as she followed Katie into the room. She could hear the two women talking as Katie dressed. Adelia leaned back in the seat and peered about the room, which didn't have a single quality about it that reminded her of a shop. It was only the front of the store that would make anyone realize it was a clothing and fabric shop. The door opened and Adelia held her breath, nervously awaiting the reveal. Mrs. McDonough walked through the door before Katy and presented her with an outstretched arm. Adelia's eyes filled with tears the moment Katy walked through the door. Her long dress made her appear taller and regal. She looked like a princess with the lace gleaming in the sunlight. Her brown hair cascaded around her shoulders and Adelia pushed herself out of the seat, amazed at how beautiful Katy appeared. "It's beautiful," Adelia told her, wiping away a tear. "I can't believe how pretty you look, Katy." "Isn't it amazing, though? Mrs. McDonough, you've really outdone yourself." Mrs. McDonough's expression softened. "I couldn't be happier to have done it. I reckon you'll be the prettiest bride Planters Point has ever seen." Adelia didn't touch the dress but took in every detail of it. Mrs. McDonough was right. Katy would be the prettiest bride the small town had ever seen. There was no doubt Jesse would consider himself a very lucky man indeed, the moment he laid eyes on her in that dress. Chapter 11. The day had come to celebrate his little girl becoming a married woman. Scott did his best to withhold his tears and concentrate instead on the immense pride he felt in his chest. He walked around the ranch welcoming people, making sure everything for the home wedding was perfect. The weather was warm, and the altar had arrived, a tall wooden structure with hand-carved detailing. It had Carolyn's favorite flowers embedded into its design and Adelia had created wreaths of wildflowers to hang from the top. Everyone had begun to take their seats and Scott stood at the back of the yard, waiting for his little girl to walk out of the house and toward him. He'd be escorting her to the altar, where she'd promised to spend the rest of her life with Jesse. He was relieved that his daughter had chosen a good man. Adelia was sitting with the twins in the front row, her red dress visible over all the others. Her long dark hair had been braided into an intricate bun on the top of her head, and she looked delicate, despite her strong features. She was beautiful. He had to force himself to not stare at her as he waited for his daughter to approach him. The soloist waited toward the right side of the arranged chairs, and the preacher was ready at the front. Jesse looked about as nervous as Scott felt. Scott's heart raced as the door to the house opened. His little girl wasn't a little girl any longer. She walked out of that house reminding him of his late wife. Her brown hair was in small ringlets, framing her petite face beautifully. Her big eyes were locked onto Jesse, and the wildflower bouquet in her hands was clutched close to her chest. She beamed as she made her way toward him. The crowd was silent, and the soloist sang in a sweet soprano voice. Scott held out his arm for his daughter and slowly walked her down the aisle, feeling the eyes of the guests on them. He looked at Jesse, who couldn't look happier to see Katy coming down that aisle toward him. It took Scott a moment to give her hand to Jesse's. He wanted to keep her all to himself, but he knew that was impossible, and not what he really wanted for her anymore. Giving away his eldest child, having her leave to live with her husband, it was all unreal. Katy leaned forward and kissed Scott on each cheek, staring deeply into his eyes. His eldest was all grown up. The dancing took place at the dance hall, which was the only place Katy wanted for it. Scott had offered the barn, but she had been adamant. She wanted the entire town to enjoy the festivities. Old Luke, the owner of the dance hall, had allowed them to decorate for the evening. Tables were lined up along the back of the hall, with the dance floor toward the stage, where the piano player was doing his best to continue belting out the songs. Scott brought his eyes back to Adelia, who'd been nothing but wonderful and helpful throughout the entire preparation and wedding. She was clapping as the twins danced to the lively piano music. He hoped they'd both dance themselves sleepy before long. He walked toward her, noticing that she didn't see him approach. He was glad just how invested in the twins she was, always watching over them. He cleared his throat, and she brought her eyes to his, her hands lowering to her sides. "Would you like to dance?" he asked. She smiled lightly and nodded, placing her hand in his. They had yet to dance to a fun song, and he was excited to use the opportunity to speak to her. It was the first time that day that he'd had any time at all to really talk with her. In truth, They'd barely spoken in the past 2 weeks, what with all the preparations that were being made. The quick piano tune ended, and the player began a slow song, causing Scott to laugh. Just when I thought we'd have a quick dance. I prefer slow dances, anyway. I'm not very good at dancing quickly. He smiled and took her in his arms. Listen, I wanted to apologize for my behavior these past couple of weeks. Adelia was silent, waiting for him to continue. Scott could feel his heart in his throat, unsure if he was doing the right thing by being honest about how he'd been feeling. The last thing he wanted to do was push her away. It's been hard. I've got a decent amount of pent-up guilt. Carolyn, my wife, died alone. I wasn't there, and I've always had a difficult time overcoming that, he said, his voice low. She was my whole life, and she was taken while I was away. It's been hard coming to terms with it, but I'm doing my best. I understand. You do? She nodded softly. I've never dealt with that kind of difficulty, but I imagine it must be very hard. Thank you, Adelia. I appreciate that. Scott paused when he saw Sarah approaching. There was a glint in her eyes that made him frown. Why would she be looking so pleased with herself? The way she was looking at Adelia made him want to hide Adelia behind him. It was a predatory look and extremely unbecoming. Adelia fell silent as Sarah walked up to them. It wasn't the first time Sarah had interrupted their dance, and Adelia had the feeling it wouldn't be the last either. Even at the reception, she'd been staring at Adelia throughout. It reminded Adelia of the way people in New York had stared at her when they discovered her heritage. Can I speak to you for a moment, Scott? Sorry, Adelia, but this won't take long. She laughed, enjoying herself. It won't take long at all. I'm not sure, Sarah, Scott said, still holding Adelia's hands in his. We've only just started dancing. Adelia shook her head. It's fine. There's plenty of time to dance later. Sarah smirked as Scott let go of Adelia's hand. I'll just be a moment. Adelia could feel her heart thrumming as they walked off the dance floor. She moved back toward her table and saw that the twins were still dancing. Their blonde hair bobbed as they tried dancing slowly together, not quite getting the rhythm of the piano music. Adelia held up the corner her red dress while tapping her foot. She attempted to enjoy the music, but there was something about Sarah's expression that was causing her to worry. What could Sarah have to say to Scott? She was likely giving Scott her congratulations. That had to be it. She watched the twins dance until she saw Scott and Sarah from the corner of her eye. The expression on Scott's face was one she hadn't seen before. Whatever Sarah had told him had shook him to his core. Adelia's heart beat even more quickly as he strode toward her. She felt her throat close up at seeing him, almost wanting to run out of the dance hall. This was bad. Whatever it was. Why didn't you tell me? His voice was low, and his eyes were wild. Adelia slinked back against her chair, unsure of what to say. Fear grabbed her as she knew what Sarah had told him. But how had she found out? How? You're part Indian, he accused. She could tell it was costing him not to make a scene at his daughter's wedding dance. Her eyes widened. Scott shook his head, clenching his teeth. He inhaled sharply. You should have said something. You know what happened to Carolyn, and still, you remain silent. You don't think that we should have known? I am sorry, Scott, Adelia stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. Can we discuss this when we get back to the ranch? There's nothing to discuss. I think it's best if you pack up your belongings and head back to New York. I'll pay for your ticket, but then after that, there will be no more contact. None. Do you hear me? Adelia's heart sank and tears burned her eyes. She felt Sarah's gaze on her and could see that leer growing wider on her face. So, she'd figured it out. Somehow. But Adelia knew it was her fault for not being forthcoming in the first place. Chapter 12. The morning came, and with it, a heaviness in her chest. Adelia had packed the majority of her things the evening before. Now, there was just the last of her belongings and closing her luggage. Luckily, she'd managed to save some money from her time working at the ranch. As long as her ticket was paid for by Scott, she'd be able to rent a place for a few days once she was back in New York. Or maybe she could find another agency and start over again. But why? No one would ever want her. There was a pang of guilt in her chest that made her feel worse. Her tears had long since dried, and her eyes felt swollen. The red dress was still draped over the chair in her bedroom, a silent reminder of what had transpired. She'd leave it behind, hopefully Katie would find some use for it. She was sure that she'd dance in it at the dance hall with Jesse someday. It was a beautiful dress for a beautiful occasion, one that had started out joyous but had ended in pain, at least for her. Adelia jumped as the door to the bedroom opened. Katie was standing in the doorway, her eyes filled with tears. Adelia couldn't help but want to hold her, but it would only make leaving all the more difficult. "You shouldn't be crying the day after your wedding." Katie sniffled, and wiped the tears away with the back of her hand. "You shouldn't be leaving the day after my wedding." "I'm sorry I didn't tell you, Katie. It's my fault." "You can't help your heritage, Adelia. I don't believe you should feel guilty. I understand why you wouldn't want to say anything. I think Pa should look beyond it." Adelia shook her head. "By not saying a word, I lied to you. I should have been more honest with all of you. Please stay, Adelia." "Reconsider leaving," Katie told her, her voice wavering. "I know he'll come around. He has to." Adelia closed her luggage and leaned against the bedpost. "But he doesn't have to, Katie. And I understand his anger. Don't blame him for any of this. He's been nothing but kind to me. But you two need to stay together. He's not been so happy since Ma passed. You have to stay." Katie beckoned, her chin quivering. "What about the twins? They'll be your responsibility again." "I'm sorry, Katie." Katie shook her head and left the room, closing the door softly behind her. Adelia could feel the tears stinging her eyes again. There was no sense in staying. Scott had voiced his wishes, and he was right to want her gone. Chapter 13. Katie felt incredibly distraught. How could her father turn away someone as wonderful as Adelia? She marched through the house, searching for him. She found the twins in the kitchen, mumbling to each other. An idea began to form in her mind, and she decided she would have to force her father into seeing reason. He was a man who was far too preoccupied in his own past to realize the truth right in front of him. "I need you both to do something for me." Her words immediately caught the twins' attention. Both of them turned toward Katie, and she could tell that they'd been crying, too. The entire house was grieving the fact that Adelia was leaving. "Can you both keep Adelia from leaving right away? Just fuss or something until I get back." The smiles on the twins' faces told her enough, and she moved toward them, opening her arms wide. Both children jumped into Katie's arms and hugged her tightly. "I'll be sure to talk Pa into having her stay." Emily pulled back slightly and met Katie's eyes. Hers were the most swollen out of the two. "Can you make Miss Adelia stay? Please, please, please." "I'll do my best. Now, you both go and fuss at her. Make as much noise as you want, just this one time. And if my husband," she paused with a smile at the word husband, "comes looking for me, tell him I'll be right back." The twins shared a look, grinning from ear to ear. With that settled, Katie set out in search of her father. She had an idea where he was, considering the situation. If he was there, she hoped she wouldn't have to talk him out of his plan too intensely. It was just beyond the pastures, a wildflower field that bloomed with thousands of wildflowers every year. Near an immense tree at the edge of the field, they'd laid her mother to rest. Katie walked through the flowers, hearing the bees swarm about the flowers as she passed them. She could see her father on the bench they'd placed out there, his head barely visible over the purple lavender and snapdragons. The scent of the flowers overwhelmed her as she marched toward him, set on making things right. "Hello, Pa," she said, raising her voice so he'd hear her. "How long have you been here?" Her father turned around and narrowed his eyes against the bright sunlight. An hour or two, I reckon. What are you doing here? Why aren't you with your new husband? I will be soon. I needed to see you for a few moments. Have you been rethinking what you said to Adelia? I know that you have the right intentions, Katie, but this isn't something that concerns you. We can't have her live with us. Katie rounded the bench and stared deeply into her father's eyes. Do you think Ma would have wanted you to turn away a woman like Adelia? She waited, and when he didn't respond, she continued, no, she wouldn't. You've been so caught up in thinking that Ma wants you to live unhappily. She'd want you to be the best pa you can be, and be a good husband, too. There's a woman back at home who loves you, and you've gone ahead and broken her heart. Listen, Katie, you don't. No. You listen to me, she said, her tone sharp. I've about had with you being so upset, as though you're alone in this. I love you, Pa, but you're making the biggest mistake of your life by letting Adelia go. Can't you see that? Her father was silent as he brought his hand to the stubble on his chin. He lowered his eyes toward the tombstone at the bottom of the tree. Katie snorted in exasperation. You don't have much time. I hope you make the right decision. She drew herself up to her fullest height. I'm a married woman now, Pa, and maybe you should listen to me. Katie walked away, not wanting to hear any more of her father's excuses. Her throat was dry as she passed through the field again, following the small trail she'd created. She felt better for having told her father exactly how she felt. She just hoped it was enough. Scott stared at the tombstone until his eyes began to water. He'd never heard Katie raise her voice like that. She'd certainly never taken that tone with him before. She had never been so dreadfully serious, and that was just another thing to take into consideration. And after having seen the twins crying in their room when he told them, he knew there was a lot at stake for his family. Still, the woman had Indian blood. The very enemy of his family, and the same blood that had taken away his wife. He stared at the name on the tombstone, rereading it over and over again. Carolyn. She'd truly been the love of his life. Then what did that make Adelia? He leaned back against the bench, not knowing what to think. I've messed up, Carolyn, he said, his voice somber. Our family is falling apart. The children are upset, and a woman's come around who has brought light into our lives again. But she lied. She kept things from us. He could hear the wildflowers at his back blowing in the wind. Something in him stirred. Was Katie right? Would Carolyn want him to be happy with another woman? He thought of all the ways he'd loved Carolyn. He thought of the children she'd brought into the world, and the happiness she'd brought to those around her. She'd been a wonderful woman. When he thought of Adelia, he noticed she had many of the same qualities as Carolyn. But she was different, too. There was no mistaking that. She was beautiful in a very different way. And her personality. She was sweet and loving, and she made people happy when she was around. She had helped his daughter plan the wedding of her dreams. She was teaching the twins how to read properly. And she'd made them a family again. Scott pushed himself up off the bench and stared at the tombstone. Carolyn would have been happy to have them become a family again. There was even a good chance she and Adelia would have been friends. A tear cascaded down his rough cheek. Letting Adelia go would be a big mistake, Katie was right. There was no way he could let her leave. Their family would languish without her. She was, after all, one of them now. He lowered his head in silence for a minute and felt a breeze that caused the wildflowers to sway. I love you, and I will never forget what we had, he whispered to his wife's grave. He turned around and hurried through the field, rushing as quickly as he could toward the house. He practiced the words in his head, practiced the way he would say them. There was not much that needed to be rectified, but he wasn't sure if he could do it properly. His lungs began to hurt from running so quickly. He could feel the cool breeze against his skin, messing up his hair as he made his way through the pastures. He could see Jessie and Katie, helping Adelia place her luggage into the wagon. Jessie had already hitched up the horse, and the twins were watching from the porch with solemn expressions. It was upon seeing the twins that he knew for certain he was making the right decision. Adelia turned to see him running toward her, and Scott slowed, so as to not scare her. The last thing he needed was for her to think he was going mad. It had been his own foolishness that had allowed them to get to this point. Adelia had never done anything wrong. After all, he'd never asked about her background, had he? "Adelia," he said, trying to catch his breath as he stepped out onto the path from the pasture. "I'm so sorry." Adelia stepped away from the wagon. He could feel all of their eyes on him, and his hands began to grow clammy at the thought of Adelia turning away from him. Maybe he deserved it. Adelia's eyes filled with tears. "It's all right," Adelia told him. It was bitter to see her resigned to his decision. "I understand why you want me to leave." He lifted his hand, as though to stop her from speaking any further. He had to tell her exactly how he felt. She had to know. "No, Adelia. It's not all right. Nothing is all right." She fell silent, as though considering his words. It was clear she was confused, and he had some explaining to do if he was going to set things right. "I need to apologize to you," he said. He reached out and took her trembling hand in his. "I'm not a perfect man, nor have I ever claimed to be. I reckon you must think I'm right callous for the way I reacted. I blamed you because of your heritage, and I realize now that I was wrong. What I said to you was wrong." Adelia's eyes widened and her lips parted. "You didn't do anything wrong, Scott. I should have told you who I was. I feel terrible about it." "No, Adelia. I overreacted to the situation. I hold no blame toward you. You are who you are, and what I did was wrong." Adelia was weeping now, and he wasn't sure why. Was she upset with him? "Adelia." He was quaking as he looked deeply into her eyes. I want to ask you if you'll stay. You've brought happiness to all of us, and you mean so much to all of us. You've brought a light into our home that I never realized we needed. I'm sorry for the way I've acted. Please forgive me." Adelia's eyes flooded with tears as she nodded. Scott squeezed her hand. "That's not all, Adelia. I would like to ask you a question," he stammered. He glanced at his eldest daughter with a grateful smile before turning back to Adelia. His expression was full of hope. "Will you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Adelia broke into a beautiful smile. She looked first at him and then at Katie and the twins, then back at him. Yes. Yes. Of course. Of course, I will." Scott took her into his arms. He saw the sheer joy upon the faces of his children and knew his own face reflected that same joy. He held Adelia close and swore to himself he would never, ever let her go. The end. Thank you for listening to this heartwarming story by Susannah Calloway. You can be assured that all her books are clean and wholesome. To find other romances by Susannah Calloway, as well as the other authors at Tika House Publishing, visit www.tikahousepublishing.com. Remember to hit like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next Susannah Calloway Western romance.